Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that looks polished on the outside but rots you from the inside. A world of gleaming top hats, crisp fashion, and slow, invisible poison. Behind every dashing Victorian gentleman tipping his hat in the street, there's a factory filled with coughing workers, trembling hands, and scalps shedding faster than autumn leaves. They called it progress. You'll probably just call it horrifying because tonight we're diving into the bizarre world of Victorian hat factories. So before you get cozy, I'd really appreciate a quick like or even a subscribe. It helps way more than you know. And hey, I'm always curious where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment with your city and what time it is for you. Now lay back, close your eyes, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations! You've just woken up in the year 1852. The good news, you're employed. The bad news, you're employed in a hat factory. Your bed was a lumpy mattress in a boarding house shared with 6 other workers, and your morning alarm isn't a bell but the hacking coughs of people who've been inhaling mercury fumes for years. You drag yourself upright, run your fingers through your hair, and notice the strands don't stop coming out. That's not dandruff. That's the beginning of baldness by industrial chemistry. You shuffle to the workshop, and the moment you step inside, the air feels wrong. It's damp, metallic, and faintly sweet in a way that makes your stomach turn. Steam rises from vats where rabbit and beaver pelts are being treated with mercury nitrate to create felt. This is called carroting, because the fur turns a bright orange colour during the process. The term is cheery. The reality is not. Every breath you take fills your lungs with invisible poison, and every hour you spend here shaves days, months, maybe years off your life. By mid-morning, your head is pounding. Your hands start to twitch, the beginnings of hatter's shakes. You can't hold a teacup without splashing it, let alone shape a fine brim. Your co-workers joke about it. They have to, otherwise they'd cry. Everyone knows this work drives people mad. That's not a metaphor. Prolonged mercury exposure leads to slurred speech, memory loss, and hallucinations. You start to feel a nervous heat in your skin, like you're burning from the inside. But the foreman tells you to keep brushing, keep shaping, keep breathing it in. Fashion waits for no one, except perhaps your hairline. Outside, wealthy gentlemen parade through the streets with tall, glossy hats that gleam in the sunlight. They nod to one another with pride, never sparing a thought for the hands that made them. Whole towns like Stockport in England or Danbury in Connecticut are consumed by this trade, their populations trembling, sweating and coughing in unison. Danbury was even nicknamed the Hat City. It could just as well have been the Mad City. By evening you're exhausted. Your scalp itches, your vision blurs, and your jaw aches as if your teeth are trying to wriggle free from your gums. You collapse into bed, the taste of metal still sharp on your tongue. Tomorrow you'll do it all over again. Not because you want to, but because there's no other work. And besides, who would believe you if you said the hats were eating you alive? And if you think that's bad, wait until you see what Victorian medicine prescribed as a cure. Because instead of pulling you away from the poison, it often gave you a double dose. You would think the misery of losing your hair to mercury would be the worst part. But you're only beginning to peel back the brim of this top hat horror show. Beneath the glamour of stiff felt and polished silk, the entire process of hat production was a gauntlet of filth, fire and fumes that left bodies breaking down in real time. By stepping into the factory, you're stepping into one of the most dangerous workplaces of the 19th century, a place where progress was measured not in safety, but in how quickly hats could be turned out before the workers collapsed. The first step was pelting. That meant taking animal skins, often rabbit, hare, or beaver, and ripping off the fur. Nothing about this was gentle. The skins were soaked in solutions that reeked of urine and oil, substances meant to loosen the fibres so they could be stripped and sorted. Your nose fills with the stench that clings to your clothes, your hair, and your soul. Beaver pelts were prized above all, but by the 1800s their populations were nearly wiped out, and so hatters turned to European rabbit fur, which still carried lice and fleas as an extra bonus. If you ever wanted to know what it was like to work in a room filled with skinned rodents, now you do. Once separated, the fur was dusted with mercury nitrate, the infamous carroting stage. Workers stood over steaming vats, dipping and brushing fibres with a solution that glowed faintly orange. The vapours rose in waves, curling upward like invisible ghosts waiting to invade your lungs. No protective masks, no ventilation, not even the courtesy of an open window. Just wave after wave of sweet metallic air burning its way through your chest. Scientists of the time even knew mercury was dangerous, yet industry leaders claimed it was necessary. Fashion demanded smooth felt. Human bodies were cheaper to replace than fashion trends. After carroting came felting, the stage where the fibres were rolled, pressed, and shrunk together to form a thick fabric. Imagine shoving your hand into boiling hot water mixed with acid and soap for hours, rolling clumps of fur back and forth until your skin blistered. Felting required brute strength as much as endurance. Workers pounded the material with wooden hammers, stomped on it with their feet, and twisted it until it bound together. Every drop of sweat mixed with chemicals soaking your clothes and staining your skin. Some described the feeling of constant burning rashes and sores that never fully healed. The line between a hatter's hands and the tools they use blurred into one long scar. But the misery was not done. To finish the fabric, the hat bodies had to be shaped over wooden blocks, stiffened with shellac, and coated with dye. Those dyes were as toxic as the mercury itself. Lead-based blacks and arsenic greens seeped into the air, staining fingernails and teeth. The steam rising from dye pots carried invisible particles that sank deep into your lungs. When you coughed, it was not just phlegm that came up, but streaks of colour, as though your own body had turned into part of the product line. And then came polishing. The hats were sanded with powders of pumice, or brushed with shellac dissolved in alcohol, sometimes even mixed with more mercury compounds for that glossy sheen. Sparks often flew from friction, igniting fumes in the cramped workshops. Fires were a constant threat, turning already deadly workplaces into tinderboxes of exploding solvents. Hatters joked about it because humour was the only thing that kept them sane, but the truth was that one careless brushstroke could send a workshop up in flames faster than you could shout for help. The real horror was not just in the factory walls, though. Entire communities became poisoned ecosystems. Wastewater from the workshops drained into rivers, carrying mercury with it. Fish populations collapsed, and people who relied on those fish began to show the same tremors and memory loss as the hatters themselves. It was not uncommon for whole families to display signs of poisoning, even if only one person worked in the trade. In Danbury, Connecticut, one of the largest hat-making hubs in the United States, the local river was nicknamed the Still River, not because it was calm, but because it carried a constant stream of mercury-rich sludge. For decades after the industry faded, sediment tests revealed levels of mercury hundreds of times higher than safe limits. Imagine growing up drinking water laced with poison because gentlemen in London and New York insisted on a taller hat. As you stand there in the factory, sweat dripping from your brow, you begin to notice the toll around you. Workers barely in their 30s look twice their age, their hairline already receding, their hands twitching so violently they can hardly lift a cup. Their skin has taken on a pallid grey tone, their eyes watery and sunken. The phrase, "mad as a hatter," was not a whimsical exaggeration, but a grim observation. Psychosis, mood swings, and hallucinations became occupational hazards. Some workers raved, muttering nonsense to themselves while still clutching hat blocks. Others erupted in sudden fits of anger, attacking co-workers without reason. And yet production never slowed. If one man collapsed, another was hired to take his place, desperate enough to risk the same fate for a few coins a week. Think of the absurdity here. Wealthy Victorians paraded through the streets in gleaming silk hats, symbols of sophistication and refinement, while behind the curtain entire towns were trembling, coughing, and balding into oblivion. The more extravagant the fashion, the higher the human cost. You're breathing it all in now, your own scalp itching, your tongue tinged with a metallic taste. The faint shiver in your fingers makes it hard to hold the brush steady. Somewhere outside, a gentleman tips his hat to a lady in the park, and the gesture looks charming, but you know better. Every tip of the hat is also a silent salute to the workers poisoning themselves for his style. And if you think losing your hair was humiliating, the truth is the poison went much deeper. The mercury did not stop at your scalp. It attacked your nervous system, your bones, even your teeth. They called it mercurial tremors, but you might call it something else entirely once your jaw starts to ache and your teeth begin to loosen. Because the next chapter of this fashionable nightmare is not just baldness, but the collapse of your own mouth. Your scalp might be itching from the fumes, but soon enough you realise the real betrayal comes from your own mouth. The poison creeping through your body does not politely stop at your hairline. It sinks deeper, sliding into your jaw, corroding enamel, and loosening teeth one by one. By the time the tremor set in, the inside of your mouth is a battlefield, and the enemy is not time or bad hygiene, but mercury. To the Victorians, teeth were more than tools for chewing. They were symbols of health and respectability. White teeth meant vitality. Rotting gaps meant poverty. Yet here in the hat factories, workers could barely hang on to theirs. Mercury exposure attacked the connective tissues that held teeth in place. Gums inflamed, teeth darkened, and jaws throbbed with pain. A hatter might smile one month and whistle through missing gaps the next. Imagine a dentist's office without drills, anaesthetic or mouthwash, only pliers and prayer. That was your reality, and your teeth were the first to surrender. Historical records show entire workshops of men losing teeth before the age of 30. Some accounts describe workers with such severe jaw pain that they could not eat solid food, resorting to porridge or beer for sustenance. Beer became less of a leisure drink and more of a survival mechanism. After all, it was liquid, caloric, and did not require chewing. But the irony was rich. The very workers producing hats for gentlemen parading in clubs could not even manage a slice of bread without agony. The medical term for this was hydrogeria, chronic mercury poisoning. Symptoms included loose teeth, jaw necrosis, and sometimes a collapse of the bone itself. Victorians often did not understand the cause. Instead, they blamed poor diets, weak constitutions, or even laziness. A hatter who could not bite down was dismissed as useless, replaced by another who would soon suffer the same fate. Factories ran on a cycle of disposable bodies, and mouths rotted in rhythm with the fashion cycle. The latest style in 1860 was a tall silk topper. The hidden accessory was a mouth filled with abscesses. You would think someone might notice. But in a society where people still believed tooth powders made with crushed coral or soot were good hygiene, the suffering of hatters barely registered. Dentistry as we know it was a luxury. Only the wealthy could afford extractions with real instruments. Workers relied on self-surgery, using knives, nails, or simply yanking out loose teeth with their hands. Picture the trembling fingers of a poisoned hatter trying to grip a rotten molar, slipping again and again, until with a sickening pop the tooth gave way. Blood poured down their chin, staining the same collar that a hat would one day sit atop. The absurdity continues when you remember how fashionable hats were considered markers of cleanliness and civility. A gentleman might scowl at the sight of a missing button, yet the worker who made his hat could not chew without wincing. Social hierarchies were written in clothing, and hats carried weight far beyond function. They were badges of order, wealth, and power. But inside the workshops, where fumes gnawed away at bones, it was impossible to miss the hypocrisy. Men who could not smile without showing bloody gums were the invisible backbone of elegance. The fumes did not just erode teeth. Mercury seeped into bone, softening it, weakening it, and in some cases twisting it out of shape. Hatters described aching legs that buckled after long days of standing, spines that hunched before middle age, and jaws that cracked during yawns. Your very skeleton bent under the burden of fashion. The nickname "Hatter's Rot" became shorthand for the sight of workers limping through town, hands shaking, heads balding, and mouths collapsing inward like hollow shells. And yet, Victorian society did not care. Wealthy customers continued to demand new styles, and factories continued to churn them out. The industry was so relentless that even after mercury's dangers were widely documented, reform was slow. By the late 1800s, France and Britain debated restrictions, but production carried on. In the United States, the Danbury factories kept using mercury nitrate well into the 20th century. Even as medical journals described neurological collapse, businessmen insisted that alternatives were too expensive. Style trumped safety, every single time. Now the sensation in your own mouth grows more real. A dull throb pulses under your gums, a tooth wiggles when you push it with your tongue, and you taste a constant metallic tang. At first, you think it is a coin tucked between your teeth. Then you realize it is your own body betraying you, seeping mercury into every pore. The tremors in your hands make it impossible to steady the cup of beer you depend on to dull the pain. Each sip splashes back out, dribbling down your chin, soaking into your shirt. Respectability, it seems, has left you behind. Picture this. A Victorian gentleman tips his hat on the street, polished and proud. The man who brushed the felt and polished the brim is at home with blood on his lips and half a mouth left to smile. Fashion is rarely fair, but here it was cruel. Teeth fell, jaws rotted, bones bent, and still the hats marched forward into the public eye as gleaming symbols of status. Every shine of silk was polished with invisible decay. And if your teeth falling out was not humiliating enough, the mercury had one more trick to play. It did not stop at your bones or your gums. It climbed into your brain, rewiring your thoughts, unspooling your memories, and twisting your emotions until even you could not recognize yourself. Madness was not an insult. It was the final stage of your career. The tremors may be unnerving, and the gaps in your teeth humiliating, but nothing compares to the slow unravelling of your mind. Mercury does not politely limit itself to your scalp or gums. It slides through your bloodstream and burrows into your brain, and that is where the real damage begins. Your body shakes, your mouth drools, and your thoughts scatter like scraps of fur in a drafty workshop. Soon enough, madness is not an insult, but a job description. Victorian medical observers described hatters as restless, irritable, and unstable. The condition was so recognisable that it had a name, erethism mercurialis, though most people simply called it hatter's madness. It began with small changes, a forgotten task, a burst of temper, a tendency to mumble to yourself. Then it grew into paranoia, hallucinations and emotional swings that left workers sobbing 1 hour and laughing hysterically the next. Imagine trying to stitch felt while convinced your own shadow was mocking you. That was daily life in the factory. The phrase mad as a hatter existed before Lewis Carroll made it famous with his eccentric Tea Party character. Carroll did not invent the madness. He borrowed it from the poisoned men all around him. The public found the phrase amusing, but for hatters it was no joke. Their erratic behaviour was so common that towns with large hatting industries came to expect it. Danbury in America and Stockport in Britain were both full of twitching, trembling men who shouted at nothing and stumbled through the streets with haunted eyes. Children knew to steer clear of them. Employers knew to keep them working until they broke completely. One of the cruelest symptoms was uncontrollable anger. Mercury poisoning attacked the nervous system, turning small frustrations into explosive rages. Records describe hatters attacking co-workers with tools, smashing equipment in sudden fits, or storming out of workshops only to return hours later without memory of the event. In modern terms, you might call it a neurological meltdown. In Victorian terms, it was chalked up to a bad temperament. Families suffered as much as workers did. A father would come home shaking, muttering nonsense, slamming doors, and lashing out without reason. No one connected it to the hats. They just called it madness. The hallucinations could be even more terrifying. Mercury distorted perception. twisting shadows into figures and noises into voices. Some hatters claimed to see animals crawling across the floor that were not there. Others heard music that no one else could hear, a constant phantom chorus that never stopped. These were not harmless daydreams, but frightening episodes that left workers unable to function. A man shaping felt might suddenly scream at invisible birds and ruin hours of work. His foreman would dock his pay, then send him back to the fumes. Doctors of the period were not entirely blind to the problem. Medical texts described mercurial tremors and nervous disorders among hatters, but remedies were as laughable as they were tragic. Common prescriptions included tonics laced with alcohol or even more mercury, under the theory that the poison could cure itself if properly balanced. Patients were advised to get fresh air, drink plenty of milk, and avoid strong emotions, as if calm breathing could undo years of inhaling toxic vapours. The advice was useless. The only cure was to stop working in the industry, but for most hatters that meant starvation. So they kept working, trembling deeper into delirium. The absurdity of it all becomes clear when you realise that high society ignored the madness entirely. Gentlemen adjusted their hats in mirrors, women admired their suitors in polished brims, and no one gave thought to the twitching hands that had shaped them. In fact, the eccentric behaviour of hatters became a kind of public joke. Their madness was a source of amusement, not alarm. A shaking man stumbling through town might be laughed at, even mocked, rather than treated with compassion. The very phrase "mad as a hatter" was a way of trivialising their suffering, turning neurological collapse into a punchline. Consider the irony. A top hat was meant to signify dignity, self-control and refinement. Yet the people who made them embodied the opposite. Their bodies twitched, their words slurred, their minds dissolved. Every glossy brim that symbolised order was built on the chaos of poisoned brains. Society celebrated the finished product while ignoring the mental disintegration that came with it. The hatters were invisible, except when they became too erratic to hide, and then they were ridiculed. Your own thoughts begin to feel slippery. You start a task and forget it halfway through. You pick up a tool and cannot remember why. Anger flares in your chest without warning, and the urge to throw the tool across the room feels irresistible. A strange buzzing sound lingers in your ears, though no one else reacts. You catch yourself muttering to the wall, words spilling out without meaning. It is no longer just your hairline or your teeth. It is your mind unravelling strand by strand, like loose felt that can no longer be pressed into shape. The longer you remain in the workshop, the deeper the unravelling goes. Night brings no relief. Tremors keep you awake, teeth ache in your gums, and visions crawl at the edges of the candlelight. Sleep comes only in fragments, broken by shouts, or the phantom sound of machinery clanking when the room is silent. The madness is not a distant fate. It has already begun, and you can feel it taking root. And the madness was only one part of the toll. Hatters were not just losing their hair, their teeth, and their sanity. The poison they carried clung to everything around them, seeping into homes, families, and food, which meant the danger was not contained in the factory. It followed you into your own house, into the river, into your children's bodies. The community itself was being poisoned along with the workers. The madness does not end when the factory doors close. It seeps outward, clinging to your clothes, your skin, your very breath, until it follows you home like an invisible lodger. Every worker who stumbles into the street at dusk brings the fumes of mercury with them, and those fumes do not politely disappear. They spread into boarding houses, kitchens, and nurseries, turning entire communities into slow-motion tragedies. Danbury, Connecticut became infamous for this. By the mid-19th century it was known as the Hat City, producing millions of hats each year. Behind the proud nickname was an ecosystem drowning in poison. The Still River, which carried away the runoff from the hatting shops, turned into a chemical soup. Every day the factories dumped mercury-laced water into it, enough to leave a permanent stain in the mud. Fish floated belly up, not from overfishing but from the invisible metal in their gills. Generations later, scientists testing the river's soil still found mercury levels high enough to poison anyone brave enough to taste it. Entire families living nearby reported tremors, memory loss, and bizarre illnesses, even if they had never once stepped inside a hatting shop. Across the Atlantic, Stockport and Denton in England suffered the same fate. These towns had once been quiet centres of weaving and farming, but the rise of hatting turned them into hubs of twitching, balding workers. The air above the workshop shimmered with a faint haze, not quite smoke, not quite fog, but heavy enough to sting your throat. Residents knew the smell. They called it carroting air. You could walk through the town and identify which homes belonged to hatters by the constant coughing and the grey dust that clung to their windowsills. This was not just an occupational hazard, it was a civic condition. The children did not escape it either. When fathers came home coated in fumes, their families inhaled the same poison. Infants developed tremors before they could walk, their tiny hands quivering as they reached for food. Mothers reported miscarriages at alarming rates. Mercury crosses the placenta with ease, and Victorian doctors noticed that women in hatting towns lost more pregnancies than elsewhere. No one connected it to the hats. Instead, they blamed the women, accusing them of weakness, poor morality, or spiritual failings. The truth was much simpler. Their water and their air were quietly loaded with mercury dust. Think about how absurd it all was. A wealthy gentleman strolling through London in a polished silk topper believed he was displaying refinement and order. Meanwhile, entire neighbourhoods were convulsing, drooling and miscarrying so that he could look dignified on his walk to the club. The symbol of civilization was built on industrial barbarism, and the factories had no incentive to stop. Demand was high, profits were good, and replacement workers arrived constantly, desperate enough to risk the same fate. Society at large turned a blind eye. Even animals showed the effects. Horses that drank from the contaminated rivers developed nervous conditions. Cats in hatting households twitched and drooled like their owners. There are even accounts of dogs pacing in circles, confused and restless, after licking scraps tossed from the workshops. The poison did not discriminate. If you breathed, drank or ate in a hatting town, you were part of the slow collapse. Medical authorities began to take notice, but reform was sluggish. By the late 1800s, some French doctors wrote scathing reports about the toll mercury was taking on workers and towns. They pointed to whole districts where the average life expectancy was drastically lower than surrounding areas. British officials debated restrictions but hesitated, worried that limiting mercury would hurt exports. In America, the Danbury hatters kept using mercury well into the 20th century, despite overwhelming evidence of the damage. Even as late as the 1940s, the Still River was still running silver with mercury waste. The nickname Hat City might have sounded like a badge of honour, but locals knew it carried a hidden curse. Visitors sometimes remarked on how odd the residents seemed. They shook, they sweated, they muttered. To outsiders it looked like eccentricity. To insiders it was a daily reminder that the very air was poison. Some townsfolk even joked bitterly that hats were not a trade but an epidemic, a sickness you inherited simply by being born near the factories. You feel it now, walking through the town after a long day in the shop. The air outside should be cleaner, but it is not. Your chest is heavy, your head spins, and every inhale carries the faint metallic sting. At home, your children look up, wide-eyed, but their hands tremble when they reach for you. The stew simmering on the stove carries a hint of the same taste that coats your tongue. Nothing in your world is untouched. The factory is not a place you go to work. It is a place that has followed you everywhere. And yet, even as whole towns grew sick, fashion only grew more demanding. The 19th century was a golden age of hats. Silk toppers grew taller, felt bowler hats spread across classes, and workers bent themselves to the task of meeting every trend. The more hats that were sold, the more mercury that was poured into rivers, the more families crumbled. It was a cycle with no end, driven by vanity on one side and desperation on the other. But poisoned water and twitching families were still not the full picture. The real absurdity came in the clashes between workers and the owners, where hatters sickened by the trade finally tried to fight back. What began as madness in the body soon turned into battles in the courts, and those battles would leave scars across the entire industry. The factories were not just places of poison, they were engines of profit. And when workers began to realise that their twitching hands and missing teeth were more than bad luck, they tried to push back. Hatters were among the earliest groups of industrial workers to organise, not because they dreamed of political power, but because they could barely stand upright without trembling. If you want to understand the absurdity of fashion colliding with justice, you have to look at what happened in Danbury, Connecticut, where the poison backbone of the hat trade finally snapped. By the late 19th century, Danbury was producing more hats than any other city in America. It was not just a town, it was a factory in municipal form. More than a dozen companies filled its streets with workshops, each demanding long hours for little pay. The fumes from mercury nitrate coated everything, and yet owners insisted conditions were perfectly normal. Workers disagreed. In 1880, they founded the United Hatters of North America, one of the most determined unions of its day. Their goals were simple: better pay, shorter hours, and safer workplaces. Nothing extravagant. Just the chance to survive long enough to wear a hat themselves. Strikes became a recurring feature of the town. Workers laid down tools, picketed workshops, and refused to let poison production continue. The owners, predictably, fought back with lockouts and blacklists. What made the situation absurd was that both sides were fighting over a product that was slowly killing the very people who made it. Imagine staging a showdown over who gets to keep producing mercury-coated felt. It was less a labour dispute and more a tug of war over who would suffer fastest. The most famous conflict came in 1902, when the union targeted D. Lowe and Company, a Danbury hat manufacturer that refused to recognise their organisation. Workers launched a boycott, not just of Lowe's hats, but of every store that carried them. The campaign spread nationwide, a remarkable feat in an age before social media. Union men travelled across states urging consumers to shun Lowe products, wielding the only power they had, the ability to choke off sales. Lowe struck back with the law. The company sued under the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, a piece of legislation originally meant to break up monopolies like Standard Oil. In a twist of logic only the Gilded Age could produce, the law was now being used against trembling workers who wanted to keep their teeth. The case, Lowe versus Lawler, dragged on until 1908, when the United States Supreme Court ruled in favour of Lowe. The justices declared that the union's boycott was an illegal conspiracy in restraint of trade. For the first time in American history, workers could be held personally liable under antitrust law. The poisoned hatters of Danbury, already sick from mercury, were ordered to pay damages to their employer. Think of the absurdity. An act designed to dismantle robber barons was instead deployed to crush the very men coughing themselves bald in toxic workshops. Justice was blind, but in this case it was also shaking violently from mercurial tremors. The workers who could barely steady a needle were now expected to hand over their meagre wages as punishment for demanding clean air. The ruling became infamous as the Danbury Hatters case. It was a precedent that haunted American labour for decades. Unions across the country panicked, realising that any strike or boycott could bankrupt them personally. Hatters who had already lost their health now lost their security as well. The phrase "double poisoned" comes to mind. First by mercury, then by the courts. It would take years of lobbying and new legislation to reverse the damage. Only in 1932 did the Norris-LaGuardia Act finally limit the power of courts to issue injunctions against unions, offering some protection at last. By then, thousands of hatters had already succumbed to illness. Meanwhile, the industry itself was changing. Silk toppers began to decline in popularity as the 20th century wore on. Felt hats remained, but style shifted, and new production methods emerged that slowly reduced the need for mercury. In some ways, fashion saved workers where law and medicine had failed. When styles changed, poison became less profitable, and only then did it start to fade. But in Danbury the scars remained. For decades after the case, the phrase Danbury Hatters was shorthand for poisoned workers and crushed unions. Even into the late 20th century, mercury levels in the Still River were among the highest recorded in America. The strike had ended, the case had been lost, but the poison lingered long after the headlines disappeared. You can feel the weight of it now, as though the tremor in your hands is joined by the tremor of history itself. Every needle you try to thread carries not just mercury but legal precedent. Every cough is both a medical symptom and a political act. The town shakes with you, and the courts laugh at your plea. Fashion demanded victims, and the victims were silenced. And yet, even this was not the final humiliation. Hatters were not just poisoned in life, they carried their burden into death. Mercury does not politely leave the body when the heart stops. It lingers in the bones, in the soil of the graveyard, in the air above the coffins, which means that long after the hats went out of style, the workers themselves were still glowing with the invisible residue of their trade. The poison did not end with your last breath. That is the most disturbing truth of all. The mercury you inhaled in the workshop stayed with you, locked inside your bones and teeth, a permanent reminder of every hat you ever touched. Death was not an escape. It was only a transfer, from trembling bodies to trembling soil, from coughing lungs to contaminated cemeteries. Even in the grave, the hatters could not shake free of the industry that consumed them. Mercury is one of those substances that refuses to politely disappear. It binds to proteins in the body, settles into bone, and lingers in tissues long after life is gone. Modern tests on 19th century skeletons from industrial towns show elevated mercury levels still present more than a century later. Archaeologists studying burial sites in hatting regions have found that the remains glow with invisible traces of the same compound that once stiffened rabbit fur into felt. The bones themselves became historical records, each rib and jaw a toxic time capsule. Imagine the Victorian graveyard, rows of headstones tilting in the damp earth. The silence seems peaceful until you realise that below, the soil is soaked with mercury leaching from hundreds of poisoned bodies. Every rainfall carried particles deeper into the ground, spreading them outward into gardens, wells and streams. Families who buried their fathers after decades in the hatting shops unknowingly buried poison with them, a legacy that seeped into the roots of nearby trees. To this day, some of those soils remain unsafe to farm. A vegetable patch in a hatting town could come up laced with the invisible residue of an industry long gone. This was not limited to cemeteries. The waste dumped into rivers from workshops ensured that mercury entered the entire food chain. Fish carried it in their flesh, birds ate the fish, and humans ate both. Some of the highest levels of mercury contamination in North American rivers have been traced back not to modern factories, but to 19th century hatting towns. Danbury's Still River became so toxic that locals joke the fish swam upside down. It was less a river and more a liquid storage tank for industrial vanity. And the joke was not wrong. Even in the late 20th century, the riverbed still released mercury dust when disturbed, as if the ghosts of hatters were waiting just below the surface. The absurdity lies in how long it lasted. By the time the United States formally banned the use of mercury nitrate in hat making in 1941, entire generations of workers had already lived and died with the poison. But the soil, the rivers and the skeletons carried on the work long after the last top hat had gone out of fashion. In a way, the hatters never stopped producing. Their bodies became part of the industry's permanent archive, each corpse a ledger entry in the account book of fashion's casualties. Think about the contrast. In life, the hatters were ridiculed as twitching madmen. In death, they became monuments of science. Their remains studied for clues about mercury's lasting effects. Medical researchers in the 20th century exhumed bones from old cemeteries and measured mercury content, proving beyond doubt that the poison had not faded. Hatters who had been forgotten in their own time were suddenly useful again, unwilling participants in experiments long after their suffering had ended. Even silence could not save them from exploitation. And it was not just the bones. Clothing, tools, and wooden coffins absorbed mercury too. Museums today sometimes struggle to preserve old hats because the felt itself still contains traces of mercury, slowly off-gassing into display cases. A Victorian top hat sitting under glass is not just a quaint fashion relic. It is a chemical hazard, a stylish time bomb waiting to be inhaled. Curators handling these hats often wear gloves and masks, taking more precautions than the men who originally made them ever received. The irony is sharp. The workers who died to produce them never saw a mask. The collectors who preserve them now would never touch them without one. The contamination shaped towns in unexpected ways. In Danbury, when redevelopment projects were planned in the late 20th century, construction crews often discovered mercury-rich soil where old factories once stood. Entire sites required cleanup before new buildings could be raised. It was as though the ghosts of the hatters had hidden themselves in the ground, rising up to haunt developers every time a shovel struck dirt. The town's nickname, Hat City, still lingers, but it carries an undertone of curse rather than pride. You can feel the absurd permanence of it now. The trembling in your hands might stop one day, but the mercury in your bones will not. It will sit there, long after your last cough, long after your final collapse, waiting patiently to join the soil. The earth itself becomes an extension of the factory, every graveyard a new workshop producing contamination instead of felt. In life you were a worker. In death you are still part of the industry, and yet the hats marched on. Society forgot the workers, but it remembered the fashion. The top hat remained a symbol of wealth, well into the early 20th century, its shine never dulled by the graveyards it left behind. Presidents wore them to inaugurations, gentlemen wore them to theatres, and none of them realised that the bones beneath their feet were still glowing with the same poison that polished their brims. But the reach of mercury stretched even further than bones and soil. It did not just haunt cemeteries and rivers, it crept into the very culture of the Victorian world, shaping how people thought, wrote, and even joked. Madness became a punchline, the twitching worker became a caricature, and the poison that ruined lives became a metaphor, echoing in literature and popular imagination long after the fumes had cleared from the workshops. The grave may have swallowed the workers, but the culture could not resist resurrecting them, this time in the form of jokes, characters, and literary whimsy. The poisoned hatter became something larger than his twitching hands and slurred speech. He became a cultural symbol, and like all symbols, he was stripped of his suffering and remade into something more palatable. In life, he was a man coughing blood over a felt block. In stories, he became entertainment. The most famous example came in 1865, when Lewis Carroll introduced a peculiar figure in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. The character was never actually called the Mad Hatter in the text. Carroll simply wrote of a hatter who was, for all practical purposes, insane. But the phrase was already common in English by then, and readers immediately connected the dots. To Carroll's audience, the idea of a twitching, unpredictable hatter was both recognisable and humorous. They laughed where the workers themselves had cried. Carroll's inspiration was not directly from mercury poisoning, but from the cultural stereotype it had produced. By the mid-19th century, hatters were widely mocked as erratic, prone to odd speech and sudden rages. The phrase "mad as a hatter" was slang long before Wonderland, recorded in print as early as the 1820s. It is one of the clearest examples in history of industrial illness transforming into linguistic shorthand. The suffering of workers did not disappear. It was simply turned into a punchline repeated at tea tables across Britain. The irony is sharp. The very people hallucinating in workshops were being rebranded as whimsical eccentrics for children's literature. No one wanted to talk about their rotting teeth or convulsing bodies, but everyone wanted to chuckle at the image of a silly man in a large hat babbling riddles. Even today, when you hear the phrase, you probably think of Carroll's character rather than the mercury-addled labourers who inspired it. Popular culture sanded down the edges of suffering until only the absurd remained. This was not unique to Carroll. Satirical prints of the 18th and 19th centuries often portrayed hatters as wild-eyed or unkempt, reinforcing the stereotype. In some cases, cartoons showed hatters literally chasing their own hats in the street, trembling too much to catch them. The reality of neurological collapse was too grim for polite society, but as caricature it became tolerable. You could mock the Mad Hatter while still buying his products. It was a neat trick of social conscience, turning poison into performance. There is something almost cruelly Victorian about it. This was a culture that loved eccentricity in small doses, so long as it came packaged as spectacle. The same society that ignored coughing children in hatting towns applauded when Carroll's hatter spouted nonsense at a tea party. Industrial illness was invisible until it could be turned into entertainment. Then it became immortal. Even medicine played a role in cultural rebranding. Doctors in the 19th century sometimes described mercurial erethism not just as illness, but as a type of character flaw. The poisoned worker was not just sick. He was weak, nervous, or unstable by nature. That framing made it easier to treat the condition as comic rather than tragic. If a man shook uncontrollably, it was easier to laugh than to ask whether his employer was slowly murdering him. The stereotype of the unstable hatter was cemented by this medical doublespeak, shaping how entire generations thought about the trade. And it has lasted far longer than the industry itself. The top hat may have gone out of everyday fashion, but the Mad Hatter remains a cultural figure. He appears in plays, films, and television. He is a stock character, eccentric and unpredictable, his origins often forgotten. Very few who quote the phrase today know that it began in poisoned workshops, where men's minds fell apart under mercury fumes. The hatters are gone, but their madness has been repackaged into a form of immortality. It is one of history's strangest legacies, where mass suffering was distilled into a whimsical archetype. You can almost feel the bitter humour of it now. The tremor in your hand becomes a quirk. The buzzing in your ears becomes comic exaggeration. Your lost teeth become props for a character at a child's tea party. What ruined your life becomes someone else's entertainment. The poison has rewritten you as spectacle, robbing even your madness of dignity. Yet this cultural transformation did not erase the material traces. Those hats, polished and stiffened with mercury, still sat on the heads of the powerful. Presidents wore them to inaugurations, bankers wore them to close deals, aristocrats wore them to signal wealth. Every great event of the 19th century had a silent participant, the mercury in the felt, whispering of the madness behind the brim, and no one saw it, because the narrative had already shifted from tragedy to comedy. But while the culture laughed, another industry noticed. If mercury could drive men mad in the hatting trade, what could it do in medicine, cosmetics, and everyday household goods? The Victorians did not just inhale poison at work. They smeared it on their faces, swallowed it in pills, and sprinkled it into powders, convinced it could cure everything from constipation to freckles. Which meant the madness of the hatters was only one corner of a much larger story. The poison that ate through your scalp and rewired your brain was not confined to the hatting floor. Mercury had an even broader career in the Victorian world, one so absurd you almost have to admire its persistence. While hatters inhaled it unwillingly, the rest of society often swallowed it willingly, rubbed it on their skin, and even gave it to their children. If madness was the hatter's curse, it was also fashionable medicine. Victorian doctors prescribed mercury compounds for nearly everything. Constipation, syphilis, skin blemishes, tuberculosis, melancholy, and even toothaches were considered suitable targets. The most notorious form was calomel, mercurous chloride, a powdery white substance that could be mixed into pills or sprinkled into tonics. Patients were told it would purge their bodies of impurities, and in a sense it did, just not in the way they imagined. Calomel caused intense diarrhea, uncontrollable salivation, and the erosion of teeth and gums. People thought the dripping saliva meant the medicine was working. In reality, It was simply their body breaking down under the assault. The irony is that while hatters were mocked for drooling and trembling, respectable patients were praised for enduring the exact same symptoms as proof of cure. A man with syphilis would gush spit into a bowl while his physician congratulated him on responding well to treatment. Parents gave calomel to children as a laxative, only to watch them weaken and convulse. In many households, the medicine cabinet was as poisonous as the hat factory and no one saw the connection. Cosmetics were no safer. Mercury was mixed into powders and creams meant to whiten skin, erasing freckles or blemishes. Pale skin was prized as a sign of refinement, so women smeared poison on their faces daily. Over time, their complexions did not improve. Instead, they reddened, blistered, and peeled, leaving behind a patchwork of damage. Yet the cycle continued, because once your skin was ruined, you needed even more cream to cover the damage. It was a self-sustaining system of beauty through chemical sabotage. Even bath products were suspect. Some tonics advertised as invigorating or refreshing contained mercury compounds. A warm soak that should have eased sore muscles instead delivered a gentle infusion of poison through the skin. If you thought the factory air was hazardous, imagine bathing in the same substance that was eating hatters alive. This was wellness, Victorian style, and the contradictions did not end there. At the same time mercury was destroying workers in hatting towns, it was also a tool of scientific prestige. Chemists and physicians prized it for its curious properties. Its liquid form fascinated experimenters, and its apparent ability to cleanse the body earned it a place of honour in apothecaries. Doctors wrote entire treatises on its virtues, filling shelves with arguments about dosage and preparation. The fact that it was quietly dissolving mouths and minds did not stop its rise. Fashion demanded felt. Medicine demanded mercury. Together they formed a perfect storm of industrial madness. What makes it even more astonishing is how long it lasted. Calomel was still being prescribed in the United States well into the early 20th century. American soldiers in the Civil War carried calomel pills in their kits, dosing themselves into weakness while marching into battle. Generations of children were raised on spoonfuls of mercury-laced powders meant to calm them or clear their bowels. It was not until the rise of modern pharmacology that mercury was finally forced out of mainstream medicine. By then, millions had lived and died under its grip. The absurd overlap between medicine and industry meant that hatters often faced a double dose. You inhaled mercury all day at work, and if you fell ill from the exposure, the doctor might prescribe more mercury to restore your health. The cure and the cause were indistinguishable. A man shaking uncontrollably at his workbench could be told to take a mercury tonic to steady himself, effectively drinking more of the substance that made him tremble. It was the medical equivalent of pouring gasoline on a fire to cool it down. Even literature and advertising reflected the obsession. Victorian newspapers were filled with glowing ads for patent medicines, many boasting mercury among their ingredients. Some promised to clear the complexion, others to restore vigour, and still others to cleanse the blood. The side effects were rarely mentioned. Instead, testimonials praised the miraculous relief from inner obstruction or nervous weakness. Those phrases were polite codes for diarrhea and drooling, but the language of marketing transformed suffering into success. You can almost taste the metallic tang just imagining it. A spoonful of tonic before bed, a dab of cream in the morning, and a day spent breathing factory fumes. Your body becomes a reservoir of mercury from every direction. The constant tremor is not just from work, but from every sip, every swallow, every cosmetic touch. Madness and baldness are no longer occupational hazards, they are cultural norms. The persistence of mercury across so many aspects of life speaks to the Victorian obsession with control. Fashion demanded smooth felt, medicine demanded purged bodies, beauty demanded pale skin. All of them pointed to the same chemical, and all of them ignored the cost. The irony is that a society priding itself on progress embraced one of the most destructive substances known to science, and treated it as salvation. But the poison had yet another stage to play. If mercury seeped into felt, into medicine, into faces, and into rivers, it also seeped into politics. The debate over mercury use in hatting did not end with whispers in workshops or ads in newspapers. It spilled into legislatures and courtrooms, forcing governments to confront the uncomfortable question of whether fashion was worth more than human lives. And when that debate finally reached its peak, it exposed just how deep the absurdity ran. The fumes may have filled the workshops, but the arguments filled the halls of government. Once it became impossible to ignore the tremors, the rotting gums and the poisoned rivers, the question became whether anyone in power would actually do something. The short answer was usually no, or at least not quickly. Mercury in the hatting trade became a case study in how public health collided with profit, and how fashion always seemed to win. France was one of the first nations to take the problem seriously. By the late 19th century, French medical journals were publishing alarming studies on hatters, describing mercurial tremors and nervous collapse in blunt detail. Reports showed that whole districts where hatting dominated had populations visibly damaged by exposure. Doctors urged restrictions, warning that the industry was slowly dismantling its own workforce. Yet the French hatting guilds resisted fiercely. They argued that without mercury, felt could not be properly cured, and that to regulate it was to destroy their trade. The debate dragged on until 1898, when France finally passed a law restricting the use of mercury nitrate in hat making. It was one of the earliest examples of industrial chemical regulation, a milestone in occupational safety. Britain, despite being home to Stockport and Denton, two of the most prolific hatting centres in the world, moved slower. British authorities acknowledged the sickness, but hesitation ruled policy. The Factory Acts of the 19th century addressed issues like child labour and ventilation in mines, yet the hatting industry remained largely untouched. Lobbyists insisted mercury was essential, and many politicians wore hats made with the very poison under discussion. To regulate it would have been to admit that their own clothing was stitched together with suffering. By the early 20th century, Britain began to follow France's lead, introducing limits, but the damage had already spanned generations. In the United States, the story was even more absurd. Danbury, Connecticut was famous for its production, and by the turn of the century its mercury runoff had already earned national notice. Yet American regulation was glacial. It was not until 1941 that the United States finally banned mercury nitrate in hat making. By that time, nearly a century of poisoned workers had already passed through the factories, leaving behind contaminated rivers, sick communities, and court cases like the infamous Danbury Hatters strike. The ban came less as an act of mercy than as a byproduct of changing fashion. When top hats began to fall out of style, mercury finally lost its foothold. Regulation did not defeat the poison. Fashion trends did. Public health authorities often contradicted themselves. Some doctors warned of the dangers with admirable clarity. Others downplayed the issue, suggesting that the madness of hatters was more psychological than chemical. Employers leapt on those explanations, preferring to blame weak constitutions rather than dangerous fumes. It was easier to say a man was unstable by nature than to admit the factory air was slowly melting his brain. Even when evidence piled up, denials persisted, because every admission carried economic consequences, and of course politics was never free from hypocrisy. Politicians who debated mercury's dangers often did so while wearing hats made with the very substance. In parliamentary chambers and congressional halls, silk toppers bobbed above heads, while lawmakers discussed whether mercury was truly a problem. The sight would have been comical if it were not so grotesque. Leaders clothed themselves in poison, while dismissing the cries of the workers who produced it. The felt brim became both fashion and farce. The debates also revealed how society valued different classes of people. The suffering of hatters and their families was dismissed because they were working class, disposable, and largely voiceless. By contrast, when wealthier individuals began to suffer from mercury in medicine or cosmetics, the alarm grew louder. regulations often followed not from sympathy for poisoned workers, but from fear that the poison might reach higher up the social ladder. Only when gentlemen and their wives risked exposure did mercury become a true political concern. Your lungs tightened just thinking about it. Every breath in the factory was a reminder of how little the government cared. Reports could be written, debates could be held, but the fumes kept rising all the same. To be a hatter was to serve as an unacknowledged experiment in chemical exposure, a test case that dragged on for generations while lawmakers shrugged. The halls of power were as clouded with denial as the workshops were with vapour. The broader irony is that the mercury question played a role in shaping modern labour protections. The debates in France, Britain and America showed how unregulated industry could chew through entire populations, and those lessons informed later occupational safety laws. But for the hatters themselves, that progress came far too late. They became the evidence, their bodies the statistics, their graves the final reports. Reform was born not from compassion but from accumulation of tragedy. And yet, while the politicians argued, the hats themselves kept marching into the spotlight. They were not just fashion, they were symbols of authority. Judges wore them, military officers wore them, bankers wore them. To regulate mercury was not only to challenge an industry, it was to undermine the uniform of power itself. That was why it took so long. The top hat had become an emblem of the very people who might have outlawed it. The story of mercury regulation in the hat trade is therefore not just about public health. It is about the blindness of societies that prize symbols over survival. The fumes may have destroyed thousands, but the silhouette of a polished brim was too intoxicating to give up. Style outweighed sanity, fashion outvoted health, and the result was a century-long delay in protecting the people who needed it most. But the failures of governments were mirrored by failures in science. Even as some doctors warned of the dangers, others experimented with mercury in ways that only deepened the absurdity. To understand just how entangled poison was with progress, you have to look at how scientists and industrialists treated mercury not as a danger, but as a wonder. The more the workers trembled, the more the scientists marvelled. For every hatter shaking in the street, there was a professor or industrialist praising mercury as one of the most extraordinary materials ever discovered. It was a substance that fascinated the Victorian imagination, a liquid metal that seemed to defy nature itself. You could pour it like water, yet it was heavier than iron. It reflected light like a mirror, yet could dissolve into fumes with frightening ease. And in an age obsessed with progress, it was seen not as a danger but as a miracle. Laboratories across Europe were filled with the stuff. Mercury thermometers became standard tools, prized for their precision. Barometers and scientific instruments relied on its weight and expansion. It was used in electrical experiments, in chemistry demonstrations, even in physics lectures to all students. Teachers would roll mercury into pools on tabletops, inviting pupils to dip their fingers into the shimmering liquid. No gloves, no warnings, just marvel at the miracle. A child who survived the Victorian classroom did so not because it was safe, but because their exposure happened to be brief. Industry joined in the enthusiasm. Mercury was used in gilding, binding gold to metals for decorative finishes. Artisans breathed the fumes as they coated objects in thin layers of brilliance. Miners used mercury to extract silver and gold from ore, pouring it directly into sluices where it bound with precious metals before being burned away, releasing clouds of vapour. Workers in California's gold rush handled mercury by the barrel, splashing it into rivers and streams as if it were harmless. By the time anyone realised the ecological catastrophe, the waterways of entire regions were irreversibly contaminated. Even medicine, despite its disastrous side effects, promoted mercury as evidence of modern science. Doctors spoke of it with reverence, as though it were a gift from nature's own laboratory. To prescribe mercury was to demonstrate knowledge, progress, and authority. The irony is sharp. The same substance hailed as modernity's triumph was also stripping workers of their sanity, their hair, and their teeth. Progress in this sense was indistinguishable from poison. What makes it even more surreal is how willingly people surrounded themselves with mercury in everyday life. Victorian households kept barometers on their walls, filled with shimmering columns of liquid metal. Spills were common, and curious children would play with the beads rolling across the floor, chasing them like toys. Servants swept them up with bare hands, unaware that each bead evaporated slowly into the room. Mercury was not treated as dangerous waste. It was treated as fascinating decoration. The scientific journals of the time reflect the fascination. Articles described experiments where mercury was weighed, heated, cooled, and observed, all without any mention of toxicity. Chemists marvelled at its density, its ability to amalgamate with other metals, its strange behaviour under pressure. The very qualities that made it dangerous made it irresistible. To a Victorian scientist, mercury was a puzzle box of potential. To a Victorian hatter, it was a death sentence. Yet the voices of the hatters never reached the halls of science. The absurd contradiction becomes clearer the more you imagine it. A hatter coughing himself bald in Stockport could walk past a university lecture where mercury was being celebrated as an emblem of discovery. The scientist called it progress. The hatter called it madness. Both were right, in their own way. The only difference was who had the privilege of choice. You can almost feel the disconnect. The metallic taste on your tongue is not just the byproduct of the workshop. It is also the taste of an age intoxicated by progress, too dazzled by the shine of a liquid metal to ask whether it might be eating them alive. The fumes in your lungs are mirrored by experiments in lecture halls, demonstrations in parlours, and advertisements in newspapers. Mercury was not a secret. It was a spectacle. And this spectacle reached absurd extremes. Some inventors dreamed of using mercury for transportation, designing engines and devices that relied on its unique properties. Amateur experimenters kept flasks of it in their homes, conducting private trials with no understanding of the risks. Even spiritualists and mystics adopted it, believing mercury's shimmer connected it to the divine. It was not just science and industry, it was culture, faith, and fantasy rolled into one shimmering drop. But fascination has consequences. Every laboratory spill, every mining sluice, every gilded trinket added to the slow accumulation of mercury in the environment. It was not just hatters who carried the poison in their bones. Entire landscapes did. And when those landscapes were finally studied, the truth became unavoidable. Mercury had been less a miracle and more a slow-motion catastrophe. The strange irony is that the very reputation of mercury as a wonder delayed recognition of its danger. To admit it was deadly was to admit that progress itself was flawed, that the march of science had been blind. So the denial continued, even as hatters collapsed, miners coughed, and rivers gleamed with a toxic sheen. Mercury was too marvellous to condemn. The story of mercury as a miracle therefore intertwines with the story of hats. Both were symbols of refinement and modernity. Both concealed suffering. Both poisoned the people who made them, and both left legacies that stretched long beyond their moment of glory. Yet even as science praised mercury, workers continued to endure its most intimate assault. The madness and the baldness were visible, but there were subtler wounds too, etched not in minds or scalps, but in the rhythms of daily life. To understand just how deep the poison ran, you have to step back into the workshop and look at the day-to-day grind of hatters, where every routine was built on fumes. The factory whistle shrieks before the sun has properly risen. You drag yourself out of bed, your head pounding, your joints aching, and your hands trembling before the day even begins. This is not the fatigue of age. You are barely 30. It is the mercury humming through your veins, refusing to let your body rest. Breakfast is stale bread dunked in weak tea. The bread tastes faintly of metal, though maybe that is just your tongue. By the time you walk to the workshop, your lungs are already burning. Inside, the day begins with pelts. Piles of rabbit skins are dumped onto tables, each one greasy, stinking and crawling with leftover fleas. The air smells of urine, sweat and damp fur. Your job is to cut away the skin, leaving only the fine underfur for felting. The fibres cling to your clothes, your nostrils and your throat, so that with every breath you inhale not just poison fumes, but floating strands of animal hair. By midday, your chest feels full of fur you never swallowed. Your coughing is as much a part of the rhythm as the clatter of tools. The carroting process comes next. Vats of boiling mercury nitrate bubble in the corner, their orange fumes rising into the rafters. You dip and brush the fibres. Your hands roar from heat and chemical burn. No one wears gloves. The solution eats into your skin, leaving cracks that sting every time you flex your fingers. Your fingernails grow brittle. Your palms are perpetually red. The foreman shouts at you to work faster, as if productivity could erase the metallic taste in your mouth. By afternoon, it is felting time. You and your co-workers roll the treated fibres in hot water, pounding them into mats, your muscles straining with every shove. The room is hot, humid, and suffocating. Steam rises around you like a fog, mingling with the fumes until the air itself feels toxic to touch. Sweat pours down your back, carrying traces of mercury into the pores of your skin. The tremor in your hands grows worse, but you grit your teeth and keep rolling, because the day is only half done. Lunch offers little relief. You step outside to eat, sitting on a stone wall with a hunk of bread and maybe a piece of cheese if you're lucky. The air outside is cleaner, but only barely. Smoke from nearby chimneys mixes with the faint tang of chemicals leaking from open factory windows. You chew slowly, careful not to aggravate the aching teeth that feel as though they are already half loose. Conversation is minimal. Everyone is too tired, too aware that the whistle will blow again in a few minutes, summoning you back into the haze. The afternoon stretches into shaping and blocking. Felt bodies are pulled over wooden moulds, steamed, stretched, and pressed. The work requires steady hands, but your fingers will not stop shaking. Every mistake means wasted felt, and a docking of pay. The pressure mounts, your nerves fray, and the factory fills with the muffled curses of men trying to control bodies that no longer obey them. The absurdity is almost comical. The very job that destroyed your steadiness demands that you be steady. As evening approaches, polishing begins. Brims are sanded with pumice, brushed with shellac dissolved in alcohol, sometimes mixed with even more mercury to give that perfect glossy sheen. Sparks fly from friction, and in the cramped quarters fire is always a possibility. You work quickly, hoping not to breathe too deeply, but it is impossible. Every inhale brings with it the sweet metallic sting. By now your head is spinning, your vision blurring. The day feels endless, yet it is almost done. The whistle finally signals the end of work. You stagger home through streets filled with other hatters, all of them twitching, coughing, dragging their feet. The town itself seems tired, as if the poison has seeped into its very stones. At home your family greets you, but you notice the tremor in your child's hand when they reach for yours. The poison you carried from the factory has already found its way into them. Dinner is stew, thin and watery, but you struggle to finish even that. Your mouth aches, your stomach churns, and the metallic taste never fades. Night brings no rest. Tremors keep you awake, teeth throb, and visions flicker at the edges of your mind. You dream of fumes and fires, of hats marching out of the factory on their own, leaving behind only piles of coughing men. When morning comes, you're not refreshed. You're simply one day closer to collapse, and still the whistle calls, dragging you back into the haze. This was the cycle that defined entire lifetimes. From dawn to dusk, from youth to death, the day in the life of a hatter was a day in the life of poison. No amount of bread, tea, or rest could undo it. By the time a hat reached the shop window, it carried not only felt and silk, but hours of sweat, tremors, and hidden suffering. Every polished brim was stamped with invisible fingerprints of madness. And yet, for all its misery, the hatting trade carried a peculiar pride. To make a fine top hat was to participate in fashion's grand performance, even if the performance consumed you. Workers spoke of their craft with skill, even as it dismantled their bodies. The irony is sharp. You could be proud of your workmanship even as your hair fell out in clumps. Dignity and degradation walked hand in hand. But the day-to-day grind did not just poison individuals, it shaped entire rhythms of urban life. Towns built around hatting lived by the factory whistle, their economies tied to the fumes. Shops, schools and taverns all depended on the industry's wages, however meagre. Communities rose and fell with the demand for fashion, and when demand shifted, whole towns trembled in more ways than one. The cycle of a single day in the factory therefore became the cycle of entire communities. Each whistle marked not just hours of labour, but decades of dependence. To escape meant leaving behind everything you knew. To stay meant breathing until you shook. For the Victorian hatter, there was no middle ground. And while the daily grind consumed bodies and towns, it also left scars in unexpected places. The hats themselves, the finished products, carried traces of the poison. Museums today handle Victorian hats with gloves, because the felt still holds mercury. That means the polished brims that once crowned gentlemen at theatres and weddings were themselves silent hazards. The workers suffered most, but even the customers may have carried a faint shimmer of the same poison on their brows. The hats did not leave the factory as neutral objects. They carried with them the residue of the poison that shaped them. By the time a gentleman purchased his gleaming top hat from a London outfitter or a New York department store, it had already absorbed days of fumes, baths of chemicals, and strokes of brushes dipped in mercury-laced solutions. To the customer, it was refinement. To history, it was a toxic souvenir perched directly on the scalp. Silk top hats were the pinnacle of elegance in the Victorian age. They were tall, glossy, and imposing, meant to elongate the wearer and signal status. A man in a topper looked like he belonged in a boardroom, a courtroom, or at the opera. The absurdity is that many of those hats still carried trace amounts of mercury within the felt, meaning the more you sweated beneath the brim, the more likely you were to inhale a little of the same poison that had ruined the hatters themselves. Customers were not exposed in the same overwhelming doses, but the contact was not harmless. Imagine spending hours in a crowded theatre under hot gas lamps, your head covered by a felt oven slowly releasing fumes. Fashion did not just look heavy, it felt heavy. Bowler hats were no different. Introduced in the 1850s, they became the choice of the middle classes, durable and practical, but still shaped by the same poisonous processes. They were less extravagant than toppers, but still soaked in the legacy of mercury nitrate. Every bowler carried whispers of twitching hands and aching lungs, even if its owner never knew it. The irony grows sharper when you realise how much time Victorians spent in their hats. Unlike today, when hats are occasional accessories, in the 19th century they were near constant companions. Men wore them in the streets, in offices, in churches, even at dinner parties. Removing your hat was a sign of respect, but only temporarily. The rest of the time your scalp simmered under layers of felt that had been pressed, dyed, and stiffened with poison. If you wore a hat daily, you were not just making a fashion statement. You were carrying a portable chemical experiment. It was not only men. Women too wore hats shaped from mercury-treated felt, though often decorated with feathers, lace, and ribbons to suit the latest Parisian style. Fashion magazines praised the delicate brims and elaborate ornaments, but never mentioned the fumes still faintly clinging to them. Ladies perched hats atop elaborate hairstyles, sometimes fixed with pins, sometimes balanced at precarious angles, all the while inhaling air that had travelled directly from the factory vats. A society ball glittered with jewels and gowns, but it also shimmered with invisible clouds rising from the hats themselves. The most chilling part is that the fashion for hats coincided with the rise of enclosed public spaces. Theatres, railways and ballrooms brought hundreds of people together under poor ventilation. Add in gas lighting and coal smoke, and you had the perfect chamber for trapping air. Now fill that chamber with dozens of men and women wearing hats cured in mercury, and you begin to realise that every social gathering was also a diluted experiment in collective exposure. Nobody keeled over at the opera, but the long-term risks were real. The customers were not immune. There is a touch of comedy in the image. A gentleman in a glittering theatre claps for the soprano, while his hat quietly releases fumes into his thinning hairline. A banker at his desk tallies figures beneath a polished brim that whispers of madness. A politician delivers a speech in Parliament, while his topper leeches the faintest traces of poison down his forehead. The very symbols of order, wealth, and respectability carried chaos stitched into their fibres. The world tipped its hats to progress without realising progress was eating its scalp. What makes it even more absurd is how expensive these hats were. A fine silk top hat could cost the equivalent of hundreds of dollars today. Customers paid premium prices for products that carried invisible hazards. Fashion was not just deadly for the makers, it was costly for the buyers, in every sense of the word. The brims may have been polished, but the receipts carried an invisible footnote. Caution. Contents may include madness. And yet society embraced hats more than ever. Etiquette manuals of the period emphasised their necessity. A gentleman caught without a hat was considered half-dressed, even indecent. To tip your hat was to show civility. To remove it in a drawing room was to honour your host. Hats were social armour. Without one, you were exposed. With one, you were fashionable, even if that fashion came at a chemical price. The link between hats and respectability grew so strong that some professions made them mandatory. Clerks, bankers, politicians, and even certain factory overseers were expected to wear them at all times. Imagine the irony. Overseers in hatting towns, shouting at trembling workers to hurry, wore hats treated with the very poison that was dismantling their staff. Authority wore its hypocrisy right on its head. You can feel the weight of it now. The brim pressing down, the heat building, the faint smell of chemicals lingering at the edges. You tip your hat to greet a passerby, unaware that the gesture is layered with hidden history. To you it is politeness. To the hatter who made it, it was the last steady motion of a trembling hand. To the soil in Danbury or Stockport, it was another ounce of poison flowing into the river. The customer's hat was not just an accessory. It was the final step in a long chain of suffering. Every time a gentleman admired himself in the mirror, he was admiring hours of fumes, days of tremors, years of collective madness. The polish of fashion masked the poison beneath, but history remembers. The brims may have shone in gaslight, but they gleamed with a cost invisible to the wearer. And while the customers enjoyed their style, another irony loomed. The very fashion that demanded hats in every corner of society eventually became the fashion that doomed the industry. When the early 20th century saw styles shift away from towering toppers and formal headgear, demand collapsed. The industry that had poisoned generations of workers and customers alike began to wither. Fashion had built the madness, and fashion would bury it. But before hats began their decline, they had one more stage to dominate, one that revealed just how much control fashion held over Victorian society. Hats were not only markers of wealth, they were instruments of class, drawing lines between who belonged where and who did not. The hat on your head was not just fabric and felt, it was a declaration. In the Victorian world, hats were shorthand for class, status, and identity. The taller, shinier, and more polished the brim, the higher your place in society. It was not enough to have wealth. You had to wear it, right on your forehead, so that strangers on the street could immediately rank you. The absurdity is that this entire system of visible order was built on the invisible chaos of mercury. The top hat was the clearest marker of distinction. Introduced at the end of the 18th century and perfected in the 19th, it quickly became a symbol of authority. Politicians, bankers, lawyers, and businessmen all wore them, their gleaming silk cylinders rising like monuments above the crowd. In theory, they symbolized dignity. In practice, they were stiff ovens made of felt stiffened with poison. The man in the street saw refinement. the hatter who made it saw another decade of shaking hands vanish into smoke. Class was so tightly tied to hats that entire hierarchies could be mapped by brim alone. The wealthy elite wore tall silk toppers, gleaming under gas lamps. The middle classes embraced bowlers, sturdy and respectable but not too ostentatious. The working classes wore caps, flat and practical, signalling their labour without pretense. The military had its own elaborate headgear, from shakos to busbies, each one designed to enforce order. Hats were uniforms, visible codes that dictated how you were treated in shops, streets and public events. To step outside in the wrong hat was to risk being mistaken for the wrong class. In some cases, it was to risk ridicule altogether. Etiquette manuals of the Victorian period went into astonishing detail about how to wear and handle hats. A gentleman was expected to tip his hat to a lady, raise it to greet a superior, and remove it in church or when entering a drawing room. Failure to do so marked you as rude, ignorant, or worse, uncivilized. The hat was not just clothing, it was performance. Every gesture reinforced the invisible lines of respect and authority, and all of it rested on brims brushed with mercury fumes. The irony deepens when you consider who made these markers of refinement. Working-class men, bent over vats and blocks, inhaling poison, created the very objects that kept them excluded from higher ranks. A banker's hat gleamed only because a hatter's scalp itched. A politician's topper stood tall only because a factory worker's spine bent low. Social order was literally built on the bones of the men who could never afford the hats themselves. And this obsession with visible class markers went further than just etiquette. Laws in some regions reinforced it. Earlier centuries had sumptuary laws dictating who could wear what, and while by the Victorian period many of those restrictions had faded, the spirit remained. Hats remained one of the easiest ways to read a man's place in the social order. A silk topper at the opera meant access. A flat cap in the same hall meant exclusion. The poison in the felt did not discriminate, but society certainly did. Even the size of the hat mattered. In the early 19th century, toppers grew absurdly tall, some reaching more than a foot above the wearer's head. They looked less like accessories and more like stovepipes attached to foreheads. Newspapers mocked them, but men wore them anyway because height translated into presence. The bigger the hat, the bigger the man, or so the thinking went. By the mid-century, style settled into more manageable proportions, but the message was the same. A hat was an announcement, and no one wanted to be caught underdressed. You can almost picture the scene. A London street crowded with carriages and pedestrians, each man's hat flashing like a signal. Here a banker in a gleaming silk tower, there a clerk in a modest bowler, at the edge a labourer in a flat cap. Everyone knew the code without speaking. It was as rigid as uniforms in an army, except the battlefield was society itself, and the whole charade rested on an accessory that slowly poisoned those who produced it. The comedy lies in how seriously it was taken. Newspapers reported on hat fashions the way modern magazines report on celebrity scandals. If toppers rose an inch taller in Paris, London soon followed. If bowler brims widened, clerks adjusted theirs too. Class anxiety was stitched directly into felt, and everyone played along. Even children were swept into the ritual, with miniature versions of adult hats marking them for future roles. Childhood was not an escape, it was rehearsal, and yet the hat also betrayed its wearers. For all its dignity, it could be a liability. A gust of wind could send a top hat rolling down the street, leaving its owner scrambling undignified after it. A bowler scuffed too many times marked you as shabby. A flat cap in the wrong place earned sneers. The rules of hats were unforgiving, and failure to follow them correctly was social suicide. Fashion demanded not only your money, but your constant vigilance. Meanwhile, back in the factories, the workers laughed bitterly at the seriousness with which society treated their products. To them, hats were not symbols of refinement. They were symbols of survival, each one a paycheck bought with sweat and tremors. They knew the reality that customers could not see. Every hat worn with pride was born from misery. Every bow, tip, or flourish was a gesture performed with poisoned brims. The absurdity of class markers built on toxic fashion did not end with the Victorians. The influence of hats carried forward into the 20th century. Photographs of world leaders at summits show rows of toppers gleaming like polished monuments. Military parades bristled with ornate headgear. Even in decline, hats lingered as shorthand for order and authority. But behind the shine, the legacy of poison remained. The class system upheld by hats may have faded, but the history is etched into every surviving brim in museum collections. Curators handle them with gloves, not because they fear the etiquette of a misplaced tip, but because they fear the mercury still trapped inside. The very objects that once demanded respect now demand caution. What was once a badge of order is now a relic of absurdity. And as society's obsession with hats slowly declined in the 20th century, the industry that fed it collapsed. Towns that had lived by the whistle of the factory now struggled with silence. The poison had consumed workers for generations, and then fashion simply walked away. Communities built on hats were left trembling in more ways than one. The power of hats did not last forever. For centuries they had ruled society, towering over heads as silent declarations of order, wealth, and dignity. But fashion is fickle, and what once seemed eternal began to fade. By the early 20th century, the very accessory that had poisoned workers and dictated class began to lose its grip. The collapse of hat fashion was not sudden, but it was relentless, and it left behind poisoned towns wondering what to do once the brim had fallen. The seeds of decline were planted before most people noticed. The top hat, once the symbol of the gentleman, began shrinking in importance by the late 19th century. It lingered at weddings, funerals, and state occasions, but no longer dominated the streets. The bowler became the hat of the masses, but even that started to weaken under the strain of changing tastes. The rise of the automobile played a quiet but decisive role. Hats that looked magnificent when you were striding down a boulevard looked ridiculous when crammed inside a car. A tall silk topper was dignified outdoors, but it smashed into the roof of a motor car with undignified clumsiness. Practicality, not poison, began dismantling the reign of hats. World War I accelerated the shift. Military caps became the norm for soldiers, simple and functional, and many men carried those habits home. The flamboyance of the topper felt outdated in a world scarred by trenches and ration books. Society leaned toward practicality. Flat caps and simpler headgear spread among the working classes. The bowler lingered in offices, but the top hat became ceremonial, less fashion than costume. Each year it shrank in everyday life, until it was little more than a ghost of authority worn only by judges, diplomats, and undertakers. The 1920s and 30s saw another blow. Hairstyles changed, and men began showing off slicked-back looks that clashed with heavy brims. Jazz-age swagger demanded freedom, not stiff formality. Fedoras replaced bowlers, lighter and lower, but even they began to fade as casual dress gained ground. By mid-century, the dominance of hats was faltering badly. The crowning blow came in the post-war years, when informality reigned. The younger generation rejected the rituals of tipping and raising brims. Walking bareheaded was no longer scandalous. It was modern. For the hatting towns, this was not fashion. It was collapse. Stockport in Britain and Danbury in the United States, once thriving on constant demand, found themselves abandoned. Factories that had produced millions of hats closed their doors. Workers who had trembled for generations now trembled without work. The poison in their bones did not vanish just because fashion had moved on. Rivers still gleamed with mercury. Soil still carried traces of fumes. The brims were gone, but the legacy remained. Danbury in particular became a symbol of this downfall. In the early 20th century, it had been producing more than a quarter of the hats sold in the United States. By the 1960s, the industry had all but vanished. Whole neighbourhoods were left without employment. The town that had been nicknamed Hat City became a cautionary tale. Its economy collapsed and its riverbeds still saturated with poison. Locals even coined a bitter phrase, the Danbury Shakes. to describe the tremors that lingered long after the factories closed. It was not a nickname of pride. It was a diagnosis embedded in local identity. The absurdity is how sudden the cultural shift looked from the outside. For centuries, men had been unable to leave the house without a hat. Then, almost overnight, it seemed nobody wore them anymore. Photographs from the 1950s still show streets full of brims. By the 1970s, those same streets were bareheaded. The whistle of the factories stopped, and silence replaced it. Communities that had lived and died by hat demand now found themselves without purpose. The poisons remained, but the profits did not. Museums and collectors became the keepers of the brims. Old silk toppers and felt bowlers, once daily accessories, turned into fragile artifacts displayed under glass. Ironically, they were often treated with more caution in museums than they ever had been in factories. Curators wore gloves, used filters, and worried about mercury off-gassing from the felt. The hats were still dangerous long after fashion had moved on. The gentlemen who once tipped them were dead, but the poison remained, quietly radiating from the fibres. You can almost sense the emptiness in the towns. The whistle does not blow. The workshops stand abandoned, their windows shattered, their beams sagging. Children grow up without fathers working the vats, but with rivers too poisoned to fish. The poison has shifted from occupation to inheritance. Whole communities inherit the mercury in their soil, their water, their history. Fashion has abandoned them, but the cost lingers. The decline of hats and fashion therefore marks one of history's cruelest ironies. The very thing that destroyed so many workers disappeared not because of reform, not because of compassion, but because style changed. Mercury did not lose to science or safety. It lost to cars, jazz, and youth culture. Entire generations had trembled and coughed for fashion, and in the end, fashion walked away as if it had never needed them at all. And yet, even in decline, the hats carried strange echoes of their former power. Certain ceremonies refused to let them die. Top hats remained at weddings, ascot races, and inaugurations. Judges in Britain still wore them well into the 20th century. Undertakers clung to them as badges of solemnity. The hat became less fashion and more fossil, preserved in rituals even as the world moved on. But the poison did not care whether the brim was fashionable or ceremonial. It lingered just the same. If you enjoyed this trip into historical suffering, do me a favour and let me know in the comments what nightmare you want me to cover next. Maybe it's medieval dentistry, maybe it's Victorian dating, or maybe it's something even worse that I haven't traumatised you with yet. And if losing hair to mercury fumes wasn't enough bedtime entertainment, check out my other videos for even more cosy tales of human misery across history.